Britain did not stand alone in May 1940 because it was strong. It stood alone because the machinery that was supposed to protect it was breaking in real time. On paper, Britain looked like a world power. It had a global navy, a financial system that could still borrow, and an empire that stretched across oceans. But the war Britain had prepared for was a slow one, the kind where armies dig in, where fronts stabilize, where governments get time to adapt. In May 1940, Germany did not offer Britain time. It offered velocity. On 10th of May, the war changed shape. German forces struck in the west, and the Allied plan snapped almost immediately. What followed wasn't just a series of battlefield defeats. It was a systems failure. Communication, command, logistics, politics, and morale all began to deform under the same pressure. And once those systems started to fail, Britain's most important asset, its ability to make coherent decisions, became fragile. By late May, the British Expeditionary Force in France was not a symbolic deployment. It was the core of Britain's trained, modern field army, the part of the country's military that could fight a continental war at all. At its maximum, the BEF in France reached roughly 390,000 men, built around up to 13 divisions. Lose that force, and Britain doesn't just lose a campaign. It loses the human engine that would be needed to defend the island later. And this is the first thing most people misunderstand about the crisis. The weak Britain almost lost the war wasn't only about whether Britain would get invaded. It was about whether Britain would still have an army worth invading. As the German advance accelerated, the BEF and large numbers of French and Belgian troops were pressed toward the Channel, not gradually, not with tidy retreats, with the kind of speed that forces commanders to make decisions based on partial information and fear of being cut off completely. In that environment, the normal safety rails disappear. Units separate, roads clog. Ammunition and fuel get burned in place. The map stops being a map and becomes a rumor. By the time the crisis peaked, the question in London was no longer, how do we beat Germany and France? It was, how do we save what we can? That's when Dunkirk becomes more than a location. It becomes a test of whether Britain can still move reality with ships, planning, and sheer administrative force. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk, ran from 20th May to 4th June 1940. Across that span, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers were taken off the beaches and harbor and brought back across the Channel. It is remembered as a miracle because in the moment it didn't look like a plan that should work at that scale. It looked like a controlled disaster. And while the evacuation was being improvised at the edge of collapse, something even more dangerous was happening in London. The government itself began to split on the central question of the war, whether Britain should keep fighting if France fell, or whether Britain should use mediation, especially via Italy, as a bridge to negotiate. This wasn't an academic debate. It wasn't ideological theater. It was a survival calculation. Inside the War Cabinet, the conflict was sharpest around Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax. Halifax's logic was simple and cold. Britain should explore any path that might preserve its independence before the situation worsened further. If France was collapsing, if the BEF was trapped, if the Luftwaffe could turn its full weight onto Britain, then a negotiation attempt, even one routed through Mussolini, could be framed as prudence rather than surrender. The idea was not capitulate today. The idea was find out what terms might exist before the knife reaches the throat. Churchill's logic was equally simple and even colder. Once Britain signals interest in mediation, Britain's leverage begins to evaporate immediately. The act of asking becomes evidence of weakness, and if Germany is winning, Germany's terms will not be designed to keep Britain free. They will be designed to remove Britain as a future threat. This argument isn't just famous because it's dramatic. It's famous because the War Cabinet minutes show how close it became to a real pivot point, and how quickly the decision environment could have changed if one or two people moved differently. The crisis is documented through War Cabinet records held in the Coibe 65 series at the UK National Archives, and the May meetings, especially 26 to 29 May, became the knife edge. On 28 May, Churchill forced the issue beyond the small inner circle by bringing it to a wider group of ministers, the Outer Cabinet. This mattered because it widened the political base for the decision to fight on, and it signaled that if the War Cabinet fractured, the government itself could fracture. The moment functioned like a pressure valve. It pulled the debate out of a room where a single dissenting heavyweight could stall policy, and into a larger body where the emotional and political cost of seeking terms was higher. But here's the point that makes this truly a declassified episode rather than a motivational story. The fight-on decision wasn't made in a vacuum. It was made while real numbers were moving, ships loading, beaches filling, aircraft burning fuel, and men being taken prisoner by the minute. While ministers debated phrases like mediation and terms, the evacuation was determining whether Britain would have an army to defend itself at all. That is why this week is the center of gravity for Britain's entire war. If the evacuation fails, the strategic future collapses. If the government breaks, the strategic future collapses. If both fail at once, the war ends, not with invasion, but with paperwork, treaties, and a quiet neutralization of Britain as an independent power. In the next section, we're going to strip away the myth of inevitability and look at Britain's real starting position going into May 1940, what it could actually field, what it could actually defend, and what it was actually afraid of losing. Then we'll walk into the War Cabinet crisis with the full context of why negotiation sounded rational to some of the most senior men in the state. If you want the full declassified breakdown of what Britain knew in that week, the cabinet arguments, the evacuation numbers, and the decisions that nearly ended the war, subscribe now, because the next part is where the system starts to crack. Britain entered May 1940 with a dangerous illusion still intact. The illusion was that defeat would be gradual, that there would be warnings, that collapse would come with time to adjust. In reality, Britain's margin for error had already been spent before the crisis week even began. The British Army that went to France was not a disposable expeditionary force. It was the product of nearly 2 decades of limited rearmament, professional training, and hard compromises forced by budget constraints and political hesitation in the 1930s. Britain had not prepared for mass continental warfare. It had prepared for a small, highly trained force that could fight alongside allies while the Navy strangled Germany economically. That strategy only works if the Army survives long enough for pressure to accumulate. By 1940, Britain did not have a second modern field army waiting at home. It had territorial units, partially trained formations, and formations that lacked heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery, transport vehicles, radios. Much of that had gone to France with the BEF. If the BEF was lost, Britain could not simply regenerate equivalent combat power in months. It would take years. This is why the Channel mattered so much. Not as a defensive moat, but as a recovery corridor. If Britain could pull its army back across that narrow strip of water, it could rebuild. If it failed, Britain would face a future in which invasion was only one of many existential threats. A Britain without an army is not just vulnerable to Germany, it is vulnerable to collapse as a global power. The evacuation plan that became Operation Dynamo was never intended to lift hundreds of thousands of men. Early estimates inside the Admiralty were grim. Planners initially hoped to extract perhaps 45,000 troops. That figure alone tells you how close the British state believed it was to catastrophe. Anything above that would be a bonus. Anything approaching the size of the BEF would be historic. What made the evacuation possible was not a single miracle, but a stack of fragile conditions aligning just enough. German armor paused outside Dunkirk for reasons still debated, but even that pause would have been meaningless if British naval organization had failed. The Royal Navy did not simply send ships. It built a moving system under fire: routes, schedules, beach control, and air cover coordination, while the Luftwaffe attempted to choke the port and beaches into submission. The evacuation succeeded not because it was safe, but because Britain was willing to accept losses in exchange for time. Ships were sunk, aircraft were destroyed, men were left behind, but enough were pulled out to preserve the core of the army. When the operation ended on 4th of June, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers had crossed back to Britain. The number mattered not because it was large, but because it was sufficient. It crossed the threshold between total loss and salvageable future. Yet even as the evacuation numbers climbed, Britain's strategic position did not stabilize. Saving the army did not end the crisis, it merely moved the crisis forward. France was collapsing. Paris would fall within days. Once France exited the war, Britain would stand alone against a continental power that controlled the coastline from Norway to the Spanish border. This reality fed directly into the cabinet debate. Dunkirk did not solve the problem that Halifax and others were worried about. It only delayed it. The central question now became air power. Britain's ability to resist invasion depended on the Royal Air Force's fighter command, not on the Army, not on the Navy alone. Fighter command was the gatekeeper. If German bombers and fighters could dominate British skies, ports could be destroyed, shipping could be strangled, and any invasion, however risky, would become feasible. If fighter command survived intact, invasion would be suicidal. This is where one of the most misunderstood decisions of the early war comes into focus. Britain pulled its fighter squadrons back from France earlier than many of its allies wanted. This was not cowardice or betrayal. It was triage. Every aircraft lost over France was one less aircraft defending Britain itself. By late May, British leaders understood something crucial. France might fall, but Britain could not afford to bleed itself dry trying to stop it. This choice looked brutal at the time. It strained alliances and fed bitterness, but it preserved the one force that would soon decide whether Britain lived or died. Fighter command entered the summer of 1940 battered but alive, and that mattered more than any symbolic stand on the continent. The fear inside the war cabinet was not only invasion, it was strangulation. Britain's economy could not survive without imports, food, oil, raw materials. All of it came by sea. The Royal Navy was the lifeline, but it could not operate effectively if ports were destroyed and air cover collapsed. Any peace settlement that forced Britain to neutralize or surrender its fleet would end Britain's independence, even without a single German soldier landing on English soil. This is why Churchill reacted so strongly to the idea of mediation. He believed, correctly, that Germany would not offer terms that allowed Britain to remain a naval power. The fleet was too dangerous. Any settlement would demand either its internment, its reduction, or its effective paralysis. That would turn Britain into a dependent state, living at the mercy of German goodwill. Halifax did not disagree with this risk. He disagreed about timing. His position was that Britain should explore terms while it still had leverage, while the fleet was intact, while the army might still be saved, while the Air Force had not yet been shattered. From that perspective, refusing to even ask was gambling everything on future battles that had not yet been fought. This was the knife-edge logic. Both sides were arguing rationally from different assumptions. One side believed leverage would only shrink. The other believed leverage would disappear the moment Britain blinked. The decision to fight on was not heroic rhetoric. It was a bet, a calculated gamble that Britain could survive long enough for something to change. American involvement, German mistakes, or shifts elsewhere in the war. It was a rejection of certainty in favor of risk, and risk defined everything that followed. By early June, Britain had escaped immediate collapse, but it had not escaped danger. The army was home, but poorly equipped. France was gone. The skies would soon decide the next phase. Britain had chosen to fight on without knowing whether it could win the battles that choice demanded. In the next stretch, we're going to move into the counterfactual that terrified British planners the most. Not a dramatic invasion, but a negotiated peace, and lay out exactly what a German-dominated Europe with a neutralized Britain would have looked like. Not speculation, documented expectations, strategic logic, and why this outcome haunted British leaders long after the crisis passed. What frightened British leaders most was not a dramatic German landing on English beaches. It was something quieter and far more permanent. A peace that left Britain technically sovereign but strategically neutralized. Inside Whitehall, this scenario had a name even if it was rarely spoken aloud. It was the fear of becoming a second-rank power inside a German-dominated Europe. No invasion, no occupation, just limits. Limits on the fleet, limits on foreign policy, limits on alliances, limits on trade. Britain would exist, but only within boundaries Germany defined. This was not paranoia. It was inferred from how Germany treated defeated or pressured states elsewhere. The pattern was clear. Political independence could remain on paper while military and economic independence evaporated in practice. Britain's leaders understood that a negotiated settlement would not end the war's danger. It would freeze it in a shape Britain could never escape. The Royal Navy sat at the center of this fear. Britain could survive losing colonies. It could survive losing prestige. It could even survive losing continental influence. It could not survive losing the fleet as a meaningful fighting force. Once the fleet was neutralized, Britain's empire would unravel automatically. Sea lanes would become permissions rather than rights. Trade would require German tolerance. Security would depend on someone else's restraint. This is why the idea of waiting to see what terms might be offered was not neutral. From Churchill's perspective, the moment Britain showed willingness to negotiate, Germany's demands would harden around naval restrictions, and once those demands were accepted in principle, Britain would have surrendered its future even if the present looked peaceful. The counter-argument inside the cabinet was brutally pragmatic. If Britain waited until after France fell, after the Luftwaffe turned fully west, after the first major bombing campaigns began, Britain's bargaining position might be worse than useless. It might be non-existent. In that world, Germany would dictate terms without pretense. This was the logic trap of May 1940. Act early and risk surrendering leverage psychologically. Act late and risk losing leverage materially. There was no clean path. Every option carried existential downside. What ultimately tipped the balance was not optimism. It was distrust. Churchill and those aligned with him did not believe any negotiated outcome would remain stable. They believed Germany would revise terms whenever it suited German interests, once Britain had disarmed itself politically or militarily. In other words, peace would not be final. It would be provisional, and Britain would have given up the tools needed to resist when the provisional became permanent. This belief hardened into policy. Britain would not ask. It would not signal. It would not explore mediation through Italy or any other channel. It would fight on, even if fighting meant enduring a phase of extreme vulnerability. That choice immediately reframed every military decision that followed. Once Britain committed to continued war, preservation became the priority. Not conquest, not offense, survival. Fighter command was protected ruthlessly. Naval assets were dispersed and guarded. Industrial output was redirected toward aircraft and air defense. Britain began preparing not to win quickly, but to endure longer than Germany expected. This shift mattered because it denied Germany the quick decision it needed. German strategy in 1940 depended on momentum. Victories were supposed to cascade. Poland collapses, France collapses, Britain exits. The war ends in the West. Once Britain refused to exit, the German strategic timetable began to fracture. Germany now faced a choice it had hoped to avoid: either force Britain out through air power and invasion, or accept a prolonged war it was not economically designed to fight alone. The Battle of Britain did not begin as an epic duel in the skies. It began as an attempt to finish unfinished business from May. Germany needed to destroy the RAF because the RAF was the lock on the Channel door. Without air superiority, invasion was fantasy. With it, invasion was still dangerous, but conceivable. This is where the consequences of the May crisis finally crystallized. Because Britain had saved its army, preserved its air force, and refused negotiation, it entered the summer of 1940 battered but intact. Not strong, not safe, but intact enough to resist. If even one of those elements had failed, if Dunkirk collapsed, if fighter command had been bled out over France, if the cabinet had fractured and sought terms, the war would have ended in a very different shape. Not with tanks on Downing Street, but with signatures on paper that quietly removed Britain from the great power equation. That is why May 1940 matters more than any single battle that followed. It was the moment Britain chose uncertainty over certainty, risk over managed decline. The decision did not guarantee victory. It merely kept the possibility of victory alive. Everything that followed, the air war, the Atlantic struggle, the eventual return to the continent, depended on this week not breaking Britain first. In the final section, we'll step back and answer the hardest question historians still argue over: whether Britain truly had any better alternative in May 1940, or whether survival itself required a level of luck, restraint, and enemy error that no government could responsibly plan for. Then we'll close with what this crisis reveals about how modern states actually fail. Not suddenly, but through a chain of rational decisions under unbearable pressure. The most uncomfortable truth about May 1940 is that Britain's survival was not the result of a single brilliant decision. It was the result of a sequence of narrow escapes, incomplete information, and choices made under pressure that could easily have gone the other way without anyone behaving irrationally. This is why historians still argue about whether Britain truly had an alternative. From one perspective, the decision to fight on looks inevitable in hindsight. Britain survived the air war. Germany failed to invade. The United States eventually entered the conflict. Victory followed years later. But this backward logic hides how fragile the situation actually was when the decision was made. At the moment of crisis, Britain did not know the Luftwaffe would fail to destroy fighter command. It did not know German invasion planning would remain incoherent and risk-averse. It did not know the United States would become an arsenal for democracy, let alone a direct combatant. It did not know Germany would turn east and open a second front that would eventually bleed it dry. All of those outcomes were contingent. None were guaranteed. The cabinet was making decisions without access to future mistakes. This is why the argument for negotiation cannot be dismissed as cowardice or appeasement. It was an attempt to manage risk by reducing exposure. Halifax and those aligned with him were trying to avoid a scenario in which Britain bet its entire existence on a sequence of favorable outcomes it could not control. The argument against negotiation was equally grounded in reality. It recognized that some risks cannot be hedged, that certain concessions once made cannot be reversed, and that survival without agency is not survival in any meaningful sense. In the end, Britain chose to gamble not because it was confident, but because it did not trust the alternative to remain stable. It chose a path that preserved the maximum number of options at the cost of maximum short-term danger. This distinction matters because it reframes the narrative of national courage. Britain did not stand alone because it believed it would win. It stood alone because it believed surrender would foreclose every future path that still existed, however faint. The deeper lesson of May 1940 is not about heroism. It is about how modern states approach collapse. States do not usually fail because leaders refuse to act. They fail because leaders act rationally within systems that are already degrading. Communication slows, information fragments, institutions protect themselves. Decision-makers argue not about values, but about which disaster is least permanent. Britain came closer to failure than its later mythology allows because its systems were under simultaneous stress. Military defeat, political division, economic dependency, and strategic uncertainty all peaked together. The fact that the system did not break is remarkable precisely because there was no single point where a correct choice was obvious. Had the evacuation lifted fewer men, had fighter command lost a few more squadrons in France, had the war cabinet fractured one meeting earlier, Britain's story would have ended not with resistance but with accommodation, not with invasion but with managed decline enforced by a victorious continental power. May 1940 is therefore not just a British story. It is a warning about how close any state can come to irreversible loss without realizing it in the moment. Victory later rewrote the memory. But memory is not evidence. The evidence is in the minutes, the numbers, the shipping logs, the airfield reports, and the cabinet debates where no one spoke in slogans. They spoke in probabilities, and the probabilities were bad. Britain survived not because collapse was impossible, but because collapse was postponed just long enough for the strategic environment to change. That is what almost lost the war actually means. If you want more declassified episodes like this, where we break down the real decision points, not the myths, subscribe to WW2 Declassified, because the wars you think were inevitable almost never were.